Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce our chair for today's session, Professor Richard Sullivan. Richard is Professor of Cancer and Global Health at King's College London. He's co-director of the Conflict and Health Research Group and co-chair of Research for Health and Conflict in the MENA region, who is hosting today's webinar. Richard, I'll hand over to you.
Wonderful, Brad. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us to today's webinar. I'm very excited. We've got two extraordinary guests on with us today, international experts in biosecurity who have accepted quite a challenge. They're going to be addressing something today around the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly around decision making. A rather prosaic question: what's going on and what can we do about it? But actually we're sort of slightly reorientated to ask the question about what have been the issues with the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of decision making, and then to talk more about the solutions. As Brad said, this is a webinar that's being sponsored by the Global Challenge Research Fund funded program, Research for Health in Conflict. And without much ado, and we're going to sort of wade straight in. We're going to have about an hour in total for this webinar. And as Brad said, please do start sending through your questions, comments, insights as we go along. We will be able to pause and pose these questions to both our experts as we progress. But to begin with, we're going to have our opening comments about the issues around COVID-19 pandemic and decision making. And our first guest is going to be Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, followed by Dr. Filippa Lentzos, who I'll introduce more formally in a moment. Filippa. So firstly, Dr. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who's a world-leading expert in chemical and biological weapons. He's the director of the NGO Doctors Under Fire and an advisor to the Syrian medical charity USOM. Hamish has given extensive advice to government agencies, a senior MOD advisor, being ex-military himself, on CBRN, and will indeed, I think, be taking up a distinguished visiting fellow position at Magdalen College, Cambridge, later on this year. Hamish, we're really delighted to have you here. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and very much looking forward to your initial comments on the issues around the pandemic, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. And it's a huge pleasure to be with such august colleagues. I think, first of all, from a biosecurity perspective, the impact of a not very toxic pathogen has blindsided us all, axiomatically, more than perhaps a very toxic one, due to its rapid global transmission and lack of medical countermeasures. Biosecurity has been the poor relation of the other securities, especially cyber, for good reasons, as it appeared an unlikely threat, especially on a global scale. But I think COVID has changed all that. The economic impact alone requires us to mitigate this threat, which hitherto the risk was probably the likelihood low, but the impact massive. And with these odds, it's not surprising that many thought it a risk worth taking. However, not now, and I think the future likelihood is at least medium and warrants our undivided attention. The Salisbury Nervation attack, and some of you may be aware that there's a BBC drama on it, starting this Sunday, which has some rather good expert advice, so I understand, was a massive sort of neon advert to every dictator, despot and rogue state and terrorist of the massive impact that can be gained from a chemical attack. And I think perhaps COVID may have done the same for a biological attack or pandemic. Not least because the psychological impact of a chem-bio event to the physical, in my opinion, is 10⁻⁴. From my experiences in Syria, people are far more frightened of a chemical attack than they are of conventional attack, but less than 0.5% of casualties in Syria have been caused by chemical attack. And I think this ratio is not dissimilar to COVID compared to other diseases or illnesses. Also, I think COVID hitherto has been thought, or certain pandemic has thought, as a 1 in 100-year event. I suggest this is probably a false assumption. Maybe compared to Spanish flu at the beginning of last century, but did we just get away with MERS, SARS, and Ebola? global connectivity, and the millions usually in the air at any one time, means spread and transmission can be anywhere in the globe in 24 hours. There are now over 70 level 4 medical containment facilities in the world where the most dangerous pathogens are stored and worked on. This is a massive increase over the last 30 years and is definitely an Achilles heel, which now requires, in my opinion, much greater control as a global biosecurity defense system. The terror threat, I think, cannot be ignored, as biological weapons are the ultimate terror weapon, and their massive impact is exactly what terror is about. I investigated Al-Qaeda trying to use anthrax in Iraq in 2006, and also investigated the so-called Islamic State trying to introduce plague to refugee camps in Syria in 2016. And the German security services interdicted vast amounts of weaponized ricin, a biological toxin from jihadists, only last year. Combining the terror threat and the increase in level 4 containment facilities, the prospect of an I Am Pilgrim scenario is not as far-fetched as perhaps it first appears. And those of you who have not read this epic fiction novel, it's where a terrorist tries to infect the US with a vaccine-resistant smallpox virus. Some of you also remember Amerithrax biological attack in 2001, where letters laced with anthrax biological pathogen were posted in the US. 5 people were killed, 17 injured, and the cleanup at 2003 prices cost over $2 million. I think we can even less afford to be blindsided by what we're calling COVID-25. And as we begin to come out of this nightmare, we have the chance and goodwill and tailwind to mitigate the threat in future and provide the required resilience, which I will suggest my potential options to after Filippa has spoken. Over to you.
Hamish, thank you very much indeed. Extremely clear. That was really an excellent start. So again, when we're going to move straight on now. Great pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend of mine, Filippa Lentzos, Dr. Filippa Lentzos, who's at King's College London, where she works as a senior research fellow with a joint appointment both with the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine and here in War Studies Department as well. She's an associate senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, a columnist for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and indeed the NGO Coordinator for the Biological Weapons Convention. And she, of course, does a lot of consulting as well, particularly for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and the World Health Organization. So, Filippa, the floor is yours. Welcome. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for that warm welcome, Richard, and for organizing, to you and your team for organizing the whole panel. It's good to be with you, everyone. Whereas Hamish sort of provides the experience of boots on the ground in war zones, I provide the experience of heels on the ground at the United Nations. So I am, as Richard was saying, an international biosecurity policy expert. I am also the NGO coordinator to the Biological Weapons Convention, which is the multilateral treaty that completely prohibits biological weapons. I've worked on a variety of biosecurity related projects with the UN, with UNIDIR, with the WHO, with local missions in Geneva, as well as with ministries of foreign affairs back in capitals. Of particular relevance to what I'm going to speak about today is my role as an independent expert in international peer reviews of biological facilities. So I've been part of international teams of government experts that have been going into high containment labs and assessing their compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention. We were asked to come up with what we see as the main challenges in the field of biosecurity, boy, there are many. I will just highlight 3 for you, and the first is very basic but still challenging, and that is to restart the multilateral machinery post COVID, essentially. And the second, much more difficult challenge is to review the WHO response to the pandemic and to investigate the origins of the pandemic. And the third challenge, which isn't particularly COVID related, but which has had a very large presence, is to counter active biosecurity related disinformation campaigns. So I'll give a very brief and concise summary, which is what we've been asked to do, of what the current situation is with these challenges. And the first relates to restarting the multilateral machinery. Multilateral disarmament diplomacy was effectively paused during COVID, or has been effectively paused over the last few months. Some would say it's also been paused before that, but that's a different story. So the Palais des Nations in Geneva opened this week for essential staff and those who can't work from home. It's also very tentatively starting to open up to delegates with some physical meetings, particularly of the Human Rights Council and the Conference on Disarmament, likely to take place by the end of June. The number of people that are allowed to be physically present is limited, with some joining remotely via platform, which will allow for full simultaneous interpretation, or at least that's the aim. So that platform is yet to be procured, but they're working on it. And obviously this will be very important in order for multilateral diplomacy and engagement with the whole range of states to go forward. Now, meetings were originally scheduled for the Biological Weapons Convention in August and September. They're unlikely to take place in conventional physical form. The chair for this year's meeting has now this week, yesterday I believe, finally been put in place, and he will then start convening informal consultations to work out how states parties want to proceed. In terms of the second challenge that I identified, reviewing the WHO response to the pandemic and investigating the origins, there's been some movement on this issue. So at the annual World Health Assembly meeting that took place in mid-May, that's the World Health Assembly is the body that governs the World Health Organization, the WHO. So they held their annual meeting, which was held virtually for the first time. And at that meeting, the international community decided that a review would be carried out of the experience gained and the lessons learned from the WHO coordinated international response to COVID-19. So there will be this sort of inquiry by the international community, similar to inquiries that we're seeing starting in a number of different countries around the world now that we're kind of starting to open up again after the pandemic. Of course, not all countries are in the same position. It was also at that meeting, the WHA meeting, agreed that an investigation into the source of the virus and the route of introduction into the human population would be conducted. And this is good, but there were a few specifics offered on the sort of investigation that's needed. And if it's to be a genuine effort to query origins, I would argue that answers cannot solely be drawn from virology, infectious disease, genomics, genome science, and epidemiology. Can't solely be drawn just from science, right? If you're going to investigate the range of spillover sites from the wet market to an accidental lab or an accidental fieldwork infection to an unnoticed lab leak or to something else entirely different, you will need a forensic investigation that establishes a likely chain of events, enabling the investigation to shift from a could have been to a probably was. And finally, in terms of biosecurity related disinformation campaigns, that third challenge that I identified? Well, it became clear already very early on in the pandemic that misinformation and disinformation loomed large. The WHO recognized what they called an infodemic that accompanied the pandemic, and that was making it difficult for people to identify truthful and trustworthy sources of information from false and misleading ones. So in response, the WHO launched a new information platform called EpiWin, or the WHO Information Network for Epidemics Network. And that uses a series of amplifiers to share tailored information with specific targeted groups. Now, I've been interested in one specific part of that infodemic, and that is the deliberate disinformation narratives around COVID-19 and biological weapons, of which there is some history, most recently pre-COVID, from the Novichok attacks in Salisbury that Hamish already talked about. What seems clear is that these battles of influence will escalate in the future, and some serious thought by the international biosecurity policy community and by national governments will need to go into developing structures and strategies to counter them. So those are the three sort of key areas that I wanted to bring up from my perspective of international security policy. Over to you again, Richard.
Filippa, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And we're already getting questions coming in to talk about more about the WHO response and indeed the infodemic. So I think we'll come back to you in a second for the solutions. But maybe I can just turn to Hamish to start with, after you've just heard what Filippa said, and picking up on where we left off with the issues you highlighted, the underestimation of the biological threat, the biology, the bio threat as a poor relation when it comes to CBRNE. What do you think are going to be some of the solutions to these challenges that you've already illuminated? Hamish.
Great, okay, thank you very much. Just trying to unmute myself, and got a couple of wild dogs raging in the background. And thanks, Filippa, some really good points there. I think on to the mitigation of resilience. I think first of all, it's really difficult for governments to take risk in this situation, however much we want to. And the risks that we take on the battlefield and in places like Syria is very, very different. I mean, despite the fact that in the UK, you know, over 90% of the deaths are, you know, in a certain age group and people are already ill, but you know, the vast majority of the population in the UK, 66 million or whatever it is, have been locked down, you know, for I think it's 12 weeks now. It's beginning to ease. The economy might shrink by 35%, and over 6 million could well be unemployed. I think this is a similar metric across Europe and the US. Somebody did say, you know, don't make the solution worse than the problem, but you know, it is really, really challenging for governments to look into this. I've got 4 areas where I think deserve greater scrutiny when we move forward to prevent that to make sure that we don't have a COVID-25 and to make sure that we're more resilient against bio attack. And the US is slightly further forward, I think, than the UK in this, and have already presented a bill, the Global Pandemic Solutions Bill, which I've been a little bit involved in. But the first area is legislation, and I will leave Filippa very much to deal with that, because, you know, the WHO activity is something I'm aware of, but don't know in any great detail. I'm very familiar with the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that police the Chemical Weapons Convention and do a fantastic job and have pretty much removed chemical weapons from most places in the world and are very well resourced to do that. The Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, which is the legislation in that area that Philip has already alluded to, it is a bit of a poor relation to the OPCW. And I think that is an area that really needs to be scrutinised. In my simple view, we have this very well trained and resourced organisation based out of The Hague, the OPCW. I think a quick win might be to extend their reach to cover bio. Lots of challenges with that, but in resource terms, I think less difficult than setting up a completely new organisation. And I expect this probably needs to be very much led by France, the UK, and the US permanent members of the Security Council, because undoubtedly I expect the Russians and the Chinese will veto or delay any further development. I think slightly allied to this, and whatever the moral and ethical issues, it is very clear that a lot of parasitic disease has emanated from the consumption of wild animals such as bats, and having, as a soldier, been involved in the Ebola, dealing with that, and now this, it's something that we really need to look at. My next point is about data, and I don't think you'd be surprised. Biosecurity measures require the collection and sharing and security of vast amounts of data. As we use this information to secure our future, the confluence between biosecurity, economic growth, and systemic financial stability cannot be understated. The control and use of data is key to prevent and subsequently manage a pandemic and biological attack. The protection and prevention of manipulating this data, I think, is sacrosanct. The loss of at least 7 days of data and the disinformation following the initial COVID cases in Wuhan certainly allowed the virus 7 days to spread, and it did globally. Those countries like New Zealand, who have got a hold of their data, have significantly reduced the impact of this virus. And it's clear under the fog of COVID, much malicious cyber activity is happening to weaken security and defensive structures across the globe. Contact tracing and testing via a universal app or whatever seems to be a way ahead, but the protection of this data is going to be crucial. The third point I want to talk about is medical countermeasures. And it seems clear that medical countermeasures are the silver bullet, the products of such biologics and pharmaceutical drugs that can protect from or treat the effects of the pandemic or biological attack. In future, it might well be far more cost effective to pay the farm industry ahead of time to produce treatments and vaccines rather than wait for pandemic to develop and throw trillions of dollars at the problem once the horse is bolted. In response to the white powder bio attacks spawned by Amerithrax that I mentioned earlier, I was involved in developing a biological immediate action system. This was based on handheld assays which could detect up to 8 pathogens in around 3 minutes. And as 99% of the subsequent attacks were all hoaxes, this simple device mitigated that problem. And finally, my fourth bit is about production of medical countermeasures and PPE. It has been very evident in this country, particularly around PPE, that our reliance on foreign sources, especially China, has created huge issues. And in future, I don't think that we can rely on external countries to provide this to us, be it masks or respirators or ventilators. And ventilators, I think, is a very key issue, something we're struggling with in Syria at the moment, in Idlib, where OSIM, the medical organization I support, who run most of the medical facilities, a lot of the medical facilities in Idlib, have 30 ventilators for 3 million people. And just one example of what can be done, and I think University College London are on this, who developed the CPAP ventilator, and I had a very small part in helping develop the hood, and I think the chief scientist is on this call as well. This is a ventilator that costs a tenth or a fifth, or even less, more than that, less than that, of traditional ventilators. That then, potentially in Idlib, instead of spending £100,000 on 2 traditional ventilators, you could probably get 20 or 30 of these ventilators that work. And in conclusion to this, I think in order to produce an effective biosecurity stance in the future, it's most likely and will be effective if countries work together in this, and particularly the permanent members of the Security Council. I have no great hope that China and Russia are going to support our efforts in this. It strikes me that the silver bullet of medical countermeasures is something that we need to focus on, along with the domestic production of PPE and other bits of equipment, as I mentioned. The control of data and information and robust leadership will be key to ensuring that we've got a biosecurity roadmap in the future that will allow us to deal with this problem in future. And finally, as I mentioned, I think the control of level 4 containment laboratories is something that requires urgent attention, and perhaps Filippa might pick up on that. And I think China, has many questions to be answered, and needs, if it's going to be a good global neighbour, it needs to be held to account and deliver the information that is required. So those are the four areas that I think that we should focus on, certainly at the practical level, and very happy to engage in that debate, and hand back to you, Richard and Filippa.
Hamish, that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for expanding that, and there's a lot to pick up on. Maybe I can just pick up on 2 though points that you made, and segue across to Filippa to maybe discuss these and unpack them. One, around the legislation, that you made the point about the legislation, and secondly, probably connected to that, is around the level 4 laboratories, and the question there around the future security of those and whether that's going to require enhancement. And maybe again, Filippa, reflect on what Hamish was saying about how to, we've been having this discussion for 20 years, the verification of the convention, how on earth to strengthen biosecurity, both from a hostile aspect and also from a sort of natural pandemic, because it's always felt very much split between the natural pandemic sitting within public health epidemiology, whereas the hostile aspect sitting within the biosecurity program. So Filippa, back to you, if I may.
Thank you. And thank you, Hamish. That was really helpful to have this kind of big overview picture of where biosecurity needs to focus. Obviously, I'm focusing on a very narrow part of that. And your questions, Richard, which were not planned, actually segue super nicely into what I had prepared to say under this. So I think one of the biggest challenges in international security policy will be reconceptualizing and restructuring the WHO, of which there will be yet more restructuring of this international body for sure. This is not being helped along at all by America threatening to pull out their funding. Brazil is now also threatening to pull their funding. So the entire organization has been put into question by these sorts of acts. Others are very strongly supporting the organization, also critical of it, but are finding that at this particular time in the pandemic is not the moment to talk about how you restructure or reconceptualize the WHO. That is more something that would come after. And I think that's right. What I want to do is to focus on a very small part of that bigger restructuring, and that is the interface between health and security. Because traditionally, the health and security worlds have been very separate, and quite deliberately so. The World Health Organization has been reluctant to address security-related issues for fear that its public health missions would then be compromised. And that's fair enough. But the thing is, the WHO is now becoming a bigger actor in the security field. the security issues have, because the WHO has focused so specifically on public health, security issues have therefore almost exclusively been limited to arms control and to the arms control and the non-proliferation community. And this has got to change. Now, there will be some sort of investigation into the origins of the pandemic. I doubt it'll be the sort of forensic investigation that it needs to be in order to be a credible investigation. But in any case, it will highlight for the future the need to develop a more appropriate international body residing in that nexus between the health, the public health and the security spheres. Now, this could be a new organization in and of itself. So it could, for instance, report to a Global Health Security Council. So an entirely new body, right? In the same way that we have a Security Council that focuses on peace and international stability, we could also have an international, a Global Health Security Council focused on public health and threats to public health. Or we could have this new organization be linked to a new international biosafety organization that registers and accredits and oversees biological high containment facilities. That's another idea that's been being thrown around at the moment. There are many kinds of possibilities for where we could link in this kind of new organization that sits in between the security and the health worlds. Another approach would be to structure it as a subunit within an already established organization, and this could very possibly be a restructured WHO. Now, however it is configured, it would need to have a mandate to go in and investigate a suspected outbreak of international concern as soon as initial reports emerge, regardless of any indication of it being natural, accidental, or deliberate. Its investigative reports, those initial reports that body then come out with from the early stages of an outbreak, could then form the basis of collective action to protect global health, maybe by something like a Global Health Security Council. No one has this sort of mandate today. So the WHO has to be invited in by the host nation. Similarly, under the Biological Weapons Convention, if there is a suspected deliberate biological attack, the host nation would have to invite international organizations like the WHO in. And this is particularly tricky if the alleged biological weapon use is the result of civil war, for instance, or the result of internal power struggles, or indeed hybrid warfare. So it's very difficult under current international law for the international community to go into a country without being invited in by that country's government, right? This is about the sovereignty of nations. Now, a recent policy report by the Policy Exchange, instances where national sovereignty should be overruled in favor of the global community, in favor of the global good, in favor of everybody else. And this policy report suggests that animal to human virus transmission, so this spillover from animal viruses to human viruses, should in future be treated as weapons of mass destruction. And just as the world has systems to monitor nuclear facilities and ban the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, so too it is time, they say, for a new international order to inspect the biological threats that pose the greatest danger to human health and global economy. The report calls for a new or strengthened coordinating body at the international level, ideally UN-based, so it could be within the WHO, or a restructured WHO, but it could also be from some other part of the UN family of institutions. So it wants to have this coordinating body to lead the monitoring, the research and inspection of high-risk activities that increase risks of zoonotic disease outbreaks. And if countries flout the rules, they call for trade sanctions. So they very tightly couple this with economic measures. So it's clear to me that, that there's new thinking required, and that some of this new thinking about how we organize ourselves as an international community to deal with biological threats has already started. COVID-19 might just be the push that the international community needs to do something about improved monitoring of biological risks. That, of course, remains to be seen. Thanks.
Wonderful, Filippa. Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for those comments. I'm now going to maybe start reflecting back some of the questions that have come up from those participating, if I may. And I'm going to start with actually the last one at the moment, because it sort of ties in quite nicely. It's from Professor Martin Bricknell, here with us at King's College London. And this is the question to both of you. How should states adjust their decision-making to recognize that biosecurity threats may be a risk to national security? And indeed, should this be similar or different to counterterrorism or cybersecurity? Very topical question, obviously, in the UK with the setting up of this rather hasty joint biosecurity centre. Filippa, Hamish, who would like to start first? Hamish, maybe?
Yeah, no, very, very happy to pick up on that one. And Martin, yeah, a very, very good question, as always. And I think that we have seen, you know, the UK in particular really challenged on this one to make decisions. And it sort of goes back to my original point that, you know, although we always knew the impact of a bio event, pandemic, whatever, would be massive, because you know, it would appear that the threat was low, then resources were directed elsewhere. And I think hitherto we haven't really had a mechanism to deal with it, which is why I think, you know, in this country you've seen, and some others, so much use of the military in not only providing personnel to support it, but also sort of the decision-making and planning. I think we probably all agree that this, you know, this is not the 100 in a 100-year event scenario, and therefore we need to give it much greater focus and emphasis, and have the structures. And whether the biosecurity task force is what we're going to come out with in the end, you know, who knows really at the moment. From my understanding, and I'm not involved in it, it's very much dealing with the current problem rather than the next problem. And us military people are always too often being told we're fighting the last war instead of the next one. So I think we will learn a heck of a lot from it. But I think it will be, you know, it is a area that if you accept my piece, particularly about data being so critical to it, there is a huge intelligence element to that. And I think those who have approached this as it were an attack have perhaps you know, been more successful. So although I expect some, you know, for some people it's, you know, it's counterintuitive to look at it this way, I think looking at it as a major security threat is probably the way ahead. And just to pick up before I hand over to Filippa, your point, Richard, about the level 4 labs and the security thereof, you know, I really do think this is a massive issue. The only level 4 lab I know is not a million miles from where I live in Salisbury, you know, and I know that the security there is as good as it can be, and I'm just not sure that's replicated around the world. So to answer an earlier question to that one, but yeah, no, I think we really need to focus on this. I don't know how much it's cost this country. It runs into the hundreds of billions. You know, it's going to cost a lot less than that to put in a structure to make sure that we can react better in future. And all the legal and policy pieces that Filippa so clearly has articulated, I think also with the practical measures that we need to put in place in a coherent command and control structure, I'm sure is going to be, you know, an effective way to deal with what sadly I don't think, I think we could possibly see again in the next 10 or so years. Over.
Thank you, Hamish. And I guess, Philippa, taking that on, I mean, the reflection there is that, let's say, Western countries particularly have tended to place pandemics and epidemics into the public health, civilian epidemiology group to manage, if you like. And I taking what Hamish was saying there is moving this on into biosecurity and then even into bioterrorism, whereas bioterrorism clearly would sit within JTAC's remit, for example. Picking up on Martin's point about this being a national, pandemics being national security now, and that disease is a national security issue. It's not simply a matter for civilians, and one could even cogently argue that this requires professional intelligence and insight that is not the natural expertise and milieu of public health or the clinical community. What are your thoughts on that, Philippa?
Sure. Well, certainly, I think public health will always have a role to play in responding to, an epidemic and a pandemic, to any outbreak, really. There is that bit to it, but there is also this other bit, depending on whether it's natural, depending on whether it's an accident, depending on whether it's deliberate. There will be other players coming in as well. In terms of biosecurity in the UK, we've generally lobbed it in with CBRN. So responses to a biosecurity incident would be dealt with the way in which we deal with chemical and radiological and nuclear incidents, with through many of the same structures there. The United States has a very different approach. They didn't have that kind of joined up thinking. So for them, after 9/11 and the Amerithrax attacks, there was a massive focus, renewed focus on the bio bit, and which grew disproportionately to the other CBRN elements, and became much more standalone. Biosecurity responses came much more standalone in the United States. We don't have those sorts of resources in the UK, so we need to sort of lob them all together. But there has been development in how we think, development in policy and how we think about biosecurity threats and how we respond to those. One of which is very much to think of whether it's natural or accidental or deliberate, we still have the same initial response, and then later on different actors will come in depending on what is appropriate. We also have adopted a more of a One Health approach, which is also reflected more internationally, where we consider not just threats to humans, but also to animals and plants, and we have coordinated ways of dealing with those responses. And also in terms of I'm looking at my notes and they're all over the place, so they're a little bit difficult to decipher. But in terms of thinking about biosecurity as an epidemic or a pandemic as a national security risk, I mean, the National Security Risk Register has been identifying pandemics, mostly flu pandemics, as a risk category alongside things like bioterrorism attacks, but also other kinds of risks like flooding and climate change and everything else, right? So it has been thought of. There are many different areas in which biosecurity risks are considered. I also just wanted to echo what Hamish was saying about high security or high containment facilities. They are very expensive to build. As you said, they are even more expensive to sustain. And what we're seeing is a buildup in the number of these very high containment facilities globally. There is no, you would be surprised to hear, but there is no official register on the number of high containment facilities, biosafety level 4, the very highest containment facilities that we have globally. There is no established figure on that. Estimates range from sort of 40 to 90. think we're probably at the lower end of that, so 40 to 50. But there is no institution, there is no organization that is responsible, A, for tracking the numbers, B, for looking at what kind of safety and security measures these institutions are implementing, and ensuring follow-up, looking into the sorts of training that staff is getting there and making sure they're up to the similar standards. So I think some sort of international coordinating body is needed very much to look at these sorts of facilities. And that is also, to some extent, what this report from the Policy Exchange think tank was saying, that we need some sort of international oversight of these kinds of facilities.
Thank you, Filippa. I guess, a challenge that's been thrown up by one of our listeners, Adam Coots, is this issue that we always dichotomize between health and security rather than trying to combine the two things together. And maybe you could comment on that, but maybe just widen this out a little bit, away from sort of focusing on domestic capacity and capability, into taking your point there about multilateral approaches, whether that might be multilateral data and actually sharing of data in timely manner that actually allows us, A, to clinically prepare, and B, to understand what the real risk is to our various populations. But also then to have, if we're making the assumption that the threats are simply going to increase with more of these BL4 laboratories, with more animal-human interface, as we see climate change and various other changes like conflicts and instability, the challenge I have for both of you is, how realistic do you think we are, considering the difficulties at the moment that the WHO is experiencing with the unilateral withdrawal from the USA, considering the problems of UN, and I'm talking to Hamish here about Syria, for example, and the way that we've operated in these environments. How realistic do you think we are to look at multilateral solutions? Or should we be using a sort of domestic mosaic, a sort of, I dread to use this term, a sort of coalition of the willing, if you like, to take this forward? Hamish.
Yeah, really good points there, and absolutely spot on. I think I think one of the huge challenges of to begin with, we're all very inwardly focused. In my experience here in the UK and the US, quite frankly, until we've got our own shop sorted out, people seem unwilling to commit to other things. I think, of course, it should be a multinational solution. This is affecting everybody in the world. It doesn't matter your who you are, rich, poor, whatever. Everybody is affected by it. But I think that there's a huge issue over security. And I agree with Adam, this is a health and security issue. You don't want to compartmentalize it. We all sort of need to work together here because everybody has a key role to play. But I think on the security issue and this sharing of data, it is absolutely key. But, it's until a few months ago, cybersecurity was the #1 issue, the #1 problem. It seems quite mundane now, actually. But to try and convince the Russians and the Americans that they should share this level, this fidelity of data, it's not so much the data; it's the way that with all intelligence collection, it's actually how you collect it that people are really fussy about, not the information itself. And we found that in Syria, where we all know who's bombing people and bombing hospitals, but nobody wants to actually give that information out that they sort of know. So I think that is a huge challenge. It should be a multinational issue. Unfortunately, the WHO have been taking a bit of a hammering over this, and the UN also have lost a bit of its teeth. It's up to those key countries. It's about leadership, not just domestic leadership, but international leadership, which sadly is slightly lacking across the globe at the moment. With all of these things, we've got to start somewhere. and do something and work together. And you know, I might have been given the Chinese a bit of a hammering, and you know, whether it's malicious or not, the issues have stemmed from there. Not saying that the next virus will stem from there, but we've got a lot to learn from them. And I think, you know, their view of being we'll share all the information with you once it's over. Well, that's not really good enough. We need to perhaps get a group of the willing, as you suggest, Richard, to convince the unwilling that now is the time to work together, because it, you know, just because you're a Russian or a Brit or American, you can still be, yeah, suffer equally with these viruses, and nothing, no wealth or weapons, whatever, is going to protect you. So, utopic, I agree, but we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I would come in and absolutely echo what you're saying, Hamish. You know, is it realistic to look at multilateral solutions? I think multilateral solutions have to be our aspiration, right? Just like with democracy, it ain't perfect, but it's the best we've got. So we've got to keep at it. But equally, we've got to be realistic and pragmatic. As Hamish was saying, a coalition of the willing or of like-minded states, to some extent, also have a responsibility to lead where they can, when we are so bogged down in the multilateral machinery, right? That just isn't working. And one of those areas where I have some experience of that exact thing, I mean, is the Biological Weapons Convention. It's very, very polarized. It's not moving much in terms of negotiating new aspects of the convention. And there we have seen some coalitions or groupings of smaller states that have tried to come up with solutions or innovative new ways of showing that they comply with the treaty, because one of the big stumbling blocks is verification. The BWC does not have an OPCW, and it doesn't have this inspectorate, as Hamish was talking about, under the Chemical Weapons Convention. It doesn't have that because states simply cannot agree. So, and that has been a debate for, you know, nearly 50 years now. How do we do it? How can we establish this sort of body? And so a number of states have gotten together and said, well, you know, there are other ways that we can unilaterally or as groups show that we are in compliance. And some of those have been inviting other states, in fact, the entire membership of the Biological Weapons Convention, to come and visit their labs and show them around their facilities, talk to them about the sorts of experiments they're doing, the sorts of viruses and bacteria they have in their freezers, as a way of building trust and being transparent about their biodefense programs, as well as about their public health facilities. And so I think that those kinds of peer reviews, those kinds of initiatives by smaller groups of states can be very useful, but we also know they can be used, negatively as well, when we think about groups of states deciding that it's within their right to go to war with others, for instance, and a number of other examples as well. So if they're used well, I think coalitions of the willing, which has a relates more to kind of this going into war, that phraseology, I think perhaps, like-minded states might be a more neutral term to use. Yeah.
Filippa, thank you very much. We're right on the hour now. So, and I think on that note of sort of cautious optimism from both of you, and also solutions, and I think that's been very welcome to hear about how we might do things better going forwards as well. I think we're all painfully aware of a lot of the deficits and weaknesses that the pandemic, I think, has brutally exposed around the world. There are lots of things we haven't managed to get onto today. We've not really talked about fragile countries and health systems strengthening, and what we do about weaker countries that for whom, you know, it's a pipe dream even to have a reasonable health system. We've not even talked about sort of domestic preparedness within the UK and how to rebuild that. And I'm sure that's something we can pick up another time. But let me say to all the people who've been attending this webinar, thank you very much indeed. And for those of you who'll be listening to this recording, again, brought to you by the Research for Health in Conflict Global Challenge Research Fund. And last but by absolutely no means least, a very huge thank you to Brad Robinson, who organised this, and to Adam Coots as well, both who drove this along. And of course, the largest thank of all is to our two expert panelists in the biosecurity community. Really wonderful to have you both. Thank you so much for talking so eloquently and so freely with us today. Filippa Lentzos and Hamish de Breton Gordon. Thank you both very much indeed, and thank you all. And I hope you join us for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before we finish, could I just, Richard alluded to it there, our next webinar is next week on the 16th of June at 10 a.m. British Summer Time, where we'll be joined by Rita Jackman, Ghassan Abusita, and Fuad to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on therapeutic geographies across the MENA region. So we hope you can join us then. Thank you very much for joining us today, and from me also a huge thank you to the panelists and to Adam for driving this along. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.